All right, guys, today in front of me from High West Spirits, we have a Midwinter Night's Dram. This is Act 10, Scene 6. Heard a lot of mixed reviews on this bottle, some good, some bad, so I wanted to try to find out for myself. A little bit of details about this bottle. So this is a blend of two different rye whiskeys, one of which is an 80% rye, 20% malted barley. That is from High West. And then a 95% rye, 5% malted barley. That is from MGP. Both of those rye whiskeys were finished in ruby and tawny port barrels from Portugal. So this one comes in at 98.6 proof. The MSRP on this one is around that $150 price point. Again, heard a lot of mixed reviews on it. Does it live up to the hype? I know there's a lot of competition with this one with, Middle West Spirits, Sagamore. So, guys, let's find out where this one ranks amongst all those. So, without further ado, let's go. All right, guys, so as I stated, this is a blend of two different rye whiskeys, one being from High West, the other being from MGP, coming in at 98.6 proof. And again, both those ryes were finished in ruby and tawny port barrels from Portugal. Let's go ahead and get in the nose. So further away from the glass, I pick up some of those more traditional notes. I mean, there's some of that caramel, there's some vanilla, there's also some rye spice. And as you go in a little bit further, it becomes this like raspberry kind of lemon candy almost. It's very, very sweet. But those, that little bit of rye spice that kind of peeks through kind of offsets the sweetness there on the nose. Yeah, so a little bit further into the glass, I almost pick up like it's almost like a dried, some dried fruit, more of those darker fruits, like a dried, maybe like a dried date or like a dried fig. And then again, some of that rye spice kind of makes itself present with that caramel kind of vanilla further away. And then, going back in, it's almost like a kind of like a raspberry, like lemon candy almost, if you will. It's very candied on the nose, very sweet. Pretty nice nose though, guys. Let's get in the palate. Cheers. So first thing that I noticed on the palate on this one was on the front and mid palate, it's like a small little shot of like some caramel, some vanilla, and then all of a sudden it starts to go to like baking spice land where it's like cinnamon, nutmeg, like allspice that kind of sit there on the middle of the palate. And then towards the back of the palate is kind of where like that, some of those port barrels start to kind of shine through with some of that darker fruit. Not a lot of port influence, though. That's what I noticed on the first sip. It's not overwhelming. I mean, the notes are there. I didn't get them on the front or mid palate. It started to appear like mid to back palate, and then into the finish with some of that black pepper. Let's get in the second sip, guys. Okay, so that. The second sip changed a little bit. So now, again, the vanilla and kind of caramel note that was kind of there on the front of the palate is kind of just almost faded away. It's definitely like an undertone at this point. So there's like a brown sugared kind of plum note that starts to appear on the front of the palate and starts to make its way to that mid palate. But then mid palate, I think it's overly dominated by baking spices. And some spiciness from that rye as well. Some of that rye spice definitely makes itself present. It's not the proof, being at 98.6 proof, it's not very high. So those baking spices are definitely where that spice is coming from between the rye spice and the baking spices. But it's all of them. I mean, it's cinnamon, it's allspice, it's nutmeg. I don't get a lot of that port influence though on the mid palate. Like I said, it's almost a big shock of baking spices on mid palate, and then back of the palate again is where it kind of transitions back to that kind of dark fruit profile. Some again maybe a little bit of like some plum or some date with some black pepper that kind of mingles in there into the finish. It's got a medium finish, I would say. short to medium finish, but definitely on that medium side. And really, it's not. There's not a lot of viscosity to it. It's fairly dry. It's not completely drying my palate out, but it's just not oily like I was hoping it would be. Let's get into the last sip, guys. Cheers. Yeah, so that last sip stayed very consistent with that second sip, where it's like on the front of the palate now, undertones of that like vanilla kind of caramel. But then that like brown sugared kind of plum note starts to again like shine through there on the front, but then is just immediately stopped on the mid palate by those baking spices, by that allspice and that nutmeg and that cinnamon, and that like the mid palate is kind of drying on this one, but again very baking spice forward on the mid. And then once it gets to mid to back palate and into the finish, again, is where those darker fruits start to come about. Maybe some more of that plum. Definitely some plum and some black pepper that really kind of shine through there on the back of the palate and into the finish. And again, it's a short to medium finish, more along the lines of that medium side, but there's not a lot of viscosity to this one. I mean, either way, I mean, it's still a good pour. Is it worth $150? To me, no, because I think there's other whiskeys out there that are finished that could easily take this one's place. Middle West Spirits does a phenomenal job with their finished whiskeys that aren't around that price point. Sagamore, which I am local to, does an outstanding job with their finished whiskeys. Their sherry, their port, and I mean honestly, like I would take Sagamore's port over this any day. That has just it is this that Sagamore port is a completely different animal than this. There's way more viscosity. There's way more port influence on the palate from the front all the way to the back, where this one kind of skips through a little bit. It kind of gives you a little indication that there's going to be some port, and then it goes like baking spice heavy, and then back to some of that port influence. But again, kind of drying you out with all those baking spices on that mid palate. Whereas for instance, the Sagamore is just it's oily, has a great mouthfeel, a lot of influence from that port. Now I don't know if that was the intention on this one, was to not have they didn't want to overdo the port, but to me this one was. It just wasn't enough of a port influence for me anyway. Either way, though, still a pretty good pour here from High West. So I want to thank you guys for tuning in to this episode of Dusty Dan's Whiskey Reviews. I want to send a big thank you over to my buddy Todd D for letting me review this whiskey. Again, guys, it's to me, I just think there's better finished whiskeys out there. There's a lot of companies. I mean, just to name two, I think the Middle West Spirits and Sagamore, both their finishings would sink this one any day of the week. Again, it's not that it's a bad pour. I just think that it needs a little bit more of that port influence for me. That mid palate was just very drying with and kind of saturated with those baking spices, and it kind of left me really wanting some more of that port influence that I was getting on the front and then back and then into the finish, where it just lacked. Again, at $150, MSRP, I'm pretty sure it's what it goes for. Given that I can go to Middle West Spirits or I can go to Sagamore, just to name two, and get something that's way better for less, I would have to pass on this one, unfortunately. But either way, it's still a really good pour. It is something I would recommend trying in a bar if you were able to. Still has a very nice, flavor profile to it, but it was just lacking that port influence. But guys, if you're looking for more reviews like this, hit that subscribe button, bell notification to be alerted of any upcoming reviews or live streams. You also find me on Instagram at Dusty Dan's Whiskey Reviews. Until next time, guys, stay dusty.